all white labor unions. The strategy was, and it was called direct action. The strategy was you have your strike, you have your demonstration, and you purposefully don't pull a permit, right? We have a First Amendment right in this country to demonstrate, but we still have law and order. You still have to conduct noise, control noise, conduct traffic. You can't just, interrupt people's day doing your demonstration. And so you have to keep order. And this is the reason why you have to pull a permit before you do your demonstration. And so what these labor unions would do, these Marxist labor unions would do, is they would specifically and strategically not pull a permit because they wanted for the police departments to use force to remove them. And once that force was applied, there was the press to snap pictures, plaster those pictures on the front page of the New York Times, so as to give the impression to the public that these poor labor unions who are just trying to earn a living wage are being strongholded by the state, who doesn't want to give them fair wages. So they basically repurpose or redefine what the reason is. No, the reason isn't that we don't want you to have a fair wage. The reason is that you didn't pull the permit. And so they realign or they turn it around to make it look like something else. This strategy, once again, was happening since the 1920s, 30s, 40s. By the time you get to the 1960s and you now have television at play, it's no longer just the newspapers. It's now television. It's now you watching your favorite Western, and it gets interrupted by these scenes that are happening in Birmingham, Alabama, right? And so the difference, though, is that the communists since 1917, quite frankly, because you had the Russian Revolution, and you had a lot of that same kind of agitation going on here in the United States. It was different here in the United States because of, for a number of reasons, which we can probably get into later on, but you didn't have the same impact here in the States as you did in Russia in terms of the revolution that they were trying. They didn't only try in Russia, they tried it around the world. But you had, in many cases, the communists who were actually trying to violently go after various entities that they saw as their enemy. But those factions were being met with force, and the public's reaction to it was, oh, look at those Reds, look at those communists. They weren't on their side because they saw them as a bunch of hooligans, a bunch of thugs who were trying to destroy the country. That was the public's kind of perception of what the communists were trying to do. By the time you get to the 60s, you now have the aesthetic of a Negro minister. They were doing the same things, but now it's not an agitator. It's now a minister, and they're praying in the streets, and they're kneeling, and they're doing things. They're dressed, in their Sunday best. It creates a different kind of scenario. And so if you can show these people who just were, I saw the scenes of them praying, and then the very next, moment I see dogs and water hoses, fire hoses. That does something to you psychologically, to where you're now neutralized as a society, and you're no longer having the debate over states' rights versus, federal authority. That debate goes completely out the window because you're now emotionalized to cast your lot with this movement because it's a Christian movement.
It's awful to see an adult hosed down or attacked by a dog or beaten with a baton. It's a completely different thing to see a 9-year-old hosed down, and really a 9-year-old who doesn't comprehend. That is a powerful message that gets sent out to the world, and it's one, unsurprisingly, that the world reacts to in horror, in shame, and in re-engagement with these movements. Those images, they are seared into the nation's brain.
Not realizing the fact that they're up to something more nefarious. And so, we can talk about that if you want, because one of the things that they would do is they would exploit grievances. Some grievances were real, others were hoaxes. For example, a lot of these church bombings that we see, a lot of these Negro ministers were setting fire to their own churches. Which
hold up, pause.
Now, I'm not saying that was always the case, but in a lot of these instances,
drop a bomb on this. Oh my!
A lot of these instances, they were setting fire to their own churches, and to these houses that were being bombed. Look up Carl Braden and what he did. He was a communist, and he bought a house in Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, for a black communist member. And they bought a house in this all-white neighborhood, and then they brought attention to the fact that a Negro just moved into this all-white neighborhood. Carl then proceeds to bomb the house in the dead of night, and it came back on him. So he was arrested, and he was charged with sedition. Now he was the charges were ultimately dropped, but that's not because he was innocent. It's because one of the things about there he is right there. The charges were dropped ultimately because one of the things you have to understand is that the communists are a very litigious people, and they know how to work their way around the law. We mustn't look at the fact that the charges were dropped to mean that he was innocent. I mean, look at Jussie Smollett. He did a race hoax on himself, right? He said that some white guys with MAGA hats poured bleach on him, put a noose around his neck. That was obviously not true. Those charges were ultimately dropped. Is that are we to take from that Jussie Smollett was innocent? No. It's just that these people are very litigious. And Jussie Smollett, by the way, the Smolletts, when you look at their connection with Angela Davis, when you look at their connection with the Black Panthers historically, when you look at the fact that they are a communist family, I'm not just saying that, I'm not red baiting. When you look at the Smolletts, I dare anybody watching this right now, look into the Smolletts and you'll see what I'm talking about in terms of their background. They're very much a part of this as Martin Luther King and others. And so they're very litigious people. But the thing about it is when you look at Carl Braden, who was arrested for bombing his own house, Carl Braden and his wife Ann Braden would go on to be staples in the civil rights movement, working alongside Martin Luther King himself in a time where you had all these mysterious church bombings going on. Now, some of it was reactionary Klan activity, but a lot of it wasn't. A lot of it was hoaxes. A lot of it was done specifically to push the public into joining and sympathizing with the civil rights movement. I mean, these people, they play a very dirty game because they're utilitarian, which means that the ends justify the means. The ends always justify the means. They're not deontological. In other words, they don't look at whether a thing is right or wrong based upon the thing itself. They consider a thing to be right or wrong depending on how useful it is to me at a given time. So it's not like Martin Luther King was always lying on the record. He was always asked, like, are communists a part of your movement? No, there's no communists a part of my movement. Knowing good and well that Stanley Levison was a communist, Clarence Jones was a communist, Bayard Rustin was a communist, Jack Odell was a communist.
I would hope that the FBI would come out and say something that I think is much more significant. And that is that it is amazing that so few Negroes have turned to communism in the light of that desperate fight. I think it is one of the amazing developments of the 20th century, how loyal the Negro has remained to America in spite of his long night of oppression and discrimination.